Let's just dive right in with a question. Maybe the biggest, most mind-bending question there is. Is the world around you, your life, your memories, your feelings, is any of it actually real? Or could we all be living inside an incredibly advanced computer program? It's a wild thought, so let's get into it.
I know. It sounds like something straight out of science fiction. But this idea is being seriously debated by philosophers, physicists, and some of the biggest names in tech. The question itself is pretty simple, but the implications, they're absolutely staggering. Are you, right now, just a collection of code running in someone else's universe?
To get our heads around this huge idea, let's start with something we all kind of know. Think about the video game The Sims. As the player, you're basically a god, right? You control these little simulated people. You guide their lives, you manage all their needs, their hunger, their emotions, their jobs, and you watch them live out their entire life cycle. And they have no idea they're in a game. The simulation hypothesis basically asks, what if we're the Sims?
So here's the roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with how this whole idea jumped from being about video games into a serious debate. Then, we'll actually travel way back in time to find its surprisingly ancient roots. After that, we'll tackle something called the simulation trilemma, the argument that really blew this whole thing wide open. We'll hear from today's biggest supporters and skeptics, and finally, we're going to bring it all back home to that one big question. What is real?
That leap from a simple game concept to a serious scientific hypothesis really sped up with modern technology. But what's truly fascinating to me is that while our computers are new, the question itself, it's not new at all. It's ancient. And that's the thing. Technology gives this whole idea a modern, sci-fi flavor. But the core question, am I experiencing true reality, is one of the oldest and most profound questions humanity has ever bothered to ask.
Seriously, long before anyone even dreamed of a computer, philosophers were wrestling with this exact same idea. It just goes to show you this isn't some flash-in-the-pan theory. It's got a deep, rich history.
Just look at this timeline. We're talking ancient Greece, ancient China, 17th century France. This fundamental uncertainty about what we perceive as real has been a consistent thread running through all of human thought. Let's dig into a couple of these. So picture this. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato tells a story. He describes a group of people who have been chained up in a cave their entire lives, forced to stare at a blank wall. All they ever see are shadows projected on that wall. For them, these shadows are reality. Now, if one of those prisoners was freed and saw the real world, the objects casting the shadows, and then went back to tell the others, they'd think he was completely insane. Plato is asking a powerful question. What if we are all those prisoners, and the world we think is so real is just a bunch of shadows on a wall?
And then, a little later, over in China, the Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi posed this beautiful, haunting riddle. He dreamt he was a butterfly, and it was so vivid, so real, that when he woke up, he was genuinely unsure. Was he a man who had just dreamed of being a butterfly, or was he now a butterfly, dreaming he was a man? It just perfectly captures that blurring of the line between what feels real and what is real.
So for centuries, this idea just kind of simmers as a cool philosophical puzzle. Then, in 2003, everything changes. An Oxford philosopher named Nick Bostrom takes this ancient idea and reframes it using the language of modern logic and technology. And his simulation argument, it absolutely electrified the debate.
Now, before we get to his big argument, we need to understand this one key term, an ancestor simulation. The idea is that a far future, super advanced post-human civilization decides to run a highly realistic simulation of their ancestors, people like us. They might do it to study their own history, or heck, maybe just for entertainment, like a video game. But the crucial part is this: the simulated ancestors, us, would be fully conscious and have absolutely no idea they're living inside a computer. Okay, so this is the absolute core of Bostrom's argument. He says one of these three things has to be true. It's a trilemma. First, extinction. Maybe civilizations like ours almost always wipe themselves out before they can ever develop this kind of godlike technology. Second, disinterest. Maybe they get all that power, but for whatever reason, maybe ethical ones, they're just not interested in running simulations of their past. But if civilizations don't all go extinct, and if they are interested, that leaves only one door open. The third option, simulation. And here's the kicker. If that's the case, they wouldn't run just one simulation, They'd run billions of them. That would mean there are billions of simulated realities, but only one base reality. Statistically, the odds would be overwhelming that we're in one of the simulations, not the one original.
As you can imagine, Bostrom's paper kicked off a massive debate that is still raging today. It's pulled in some of the biggest names in technology and science. So let's break down the main arguments for and against.
The whole debate really boils down to a few key points. Supporters look at the insane progress in video games and VR and say, look, at this rate, it seems almost inevitable that we'll be able to create simulations that are totally indistinguishable from reality. Then the statistical argument kicks in. But the skeptics fire right back, saying the whole theory is fundamentally unprovable. I mean, if a simulation is perfect, how could you ever detect it? They also point to the absolutely staggering amount of computing power you would need.
One of the most famous proponents you'll hear about is Elon Musk. His argument is a pretty simple extrapolation. He says, look at the last 40 years. We went from Pong, which was just 2 rectangles and a dot, to photorealistic 3D games today. He argues that if you assume any rate of improvement at all, games will eventually become indistinguishable from reality. And if that's the case, it's overwhelmingly likely we're already in one of them.
But then, the skeptics play their trump card, the sheer mind-boggling scale of it all. To simulate just the people on Earth, you'd have to render over 8 billion unique, conscious minds all at the same time. And that's before you even think about animals or plants or the physics of the entire universe working flawlessly. The computational power you would need is, by any standard we can comprehend, basically infinite.
And for many scientists, this is really where the argument just falls apart. For a hypothesis to be considered scientific, it has to be falsifiable. There has to be some experiment you could run that could prove it wrong. But because a perfect simulation would, by its very nature, be designed to be undetectable, there's no experiment you could ever run. So for them, it's a fascinating philosophical thought experiment, but it's not science.
So after this whole journey from ancient philosophy to modern physics, where does that leave us? We're left staring back at the exact same fundamental question we started with. But maybe now we have a much deeper appreciation for just how tricky it really is.
You know, people often say, well, I'll just look for a glitch in the matrix. You know, like a cat walking past twice or something. But think about it for a second. If the simulators are powerful enough to create this entire universe, they're definitely powerful enough to patch a bug, rewind the system, or just edit your memory so you never even noticed it happened. Any evidence you think you found could itself just be part of the simulation. And this brings us to the final, lingering thought that I'll leave you with. If the simulation is perfect, with no escape hatch and no way of ever knowing for sure, does it actually matter? Your experiences, your joys, your sorrows, they feel real to you. And maybe that's the only reality that ever could.